Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're just going to give everyone a couple of minutes as everyone starts to come into the room. So just one more minute. And while you're coming in, feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat if you like. Okay, it seems like our numbers are leveling off. So I'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to today's webinar, exploring a new narrative to sustain support for early childhood education. Today's webinar is hosted by the Natural Start Alliance and the National Wildlife Federation's Early Childhood Health Outdoors program. My name is Christy Merrick. I'm the director of Natural Start. And as I said, please feel to introduce yourself in the chat. Also, we'll have time for questions throughout the webinar. So if you have questions that are coming up as you're listening, please feel free to put those in the chat, either to everyone or to the panelists, and we'll keep an eye on that, and we can pass those questions along as we go. To anyone who's not familiar, back, please. For anyone who's not familiar with us already, Natural Start is a project of the North American Association for Environmental Education. NAAE supports environmental educators working in all kinds of settings all around the world. And our role at Natural Start is really to focus in on early childhood education. We provide resources, research, training, networking opportunities, and in general, just really try to keep our professional community up to date on the latest thinking and research in the field so that we can all do our best work to bring high quality, nature-rich education to every young child. So we're really happy to be here talking about this new research from the communications firm 7 November. We're going to hear from Susan Pearson Brown and Kate Rose about how we can speak as clearly and persuasively as possible to early childhood education funders in particular about the value of our work. And speaking of early childhood education funders, the George B. Storer Foundation commissioned this research to help give the field more tools in finding support for our work. And Kathleen Belk-Doffermeyer is a senior program officer at the Storer Foundation, and she's here today. And she's just going to share a little bit more perspective on the Storer Foundation's role in this project.
Thanks, Christy, and hi to everybody who's here. I'm Kathleen from the George B. Storer Foundation, and I'm located here on the ancestral lands of the Eastern Shoshone and Shoshone-Bannock tribes in Jackson, Wyoming. When I'm not being a program officer, I'm the full-time mom of 2 toddlers who are enrolled in childcare. So I'm taking a crash course in this subject. So I just want to thank everybody for being in community with us today, or at a later date for those of you who are watching the recording. There's just a huge amount of experience and expertise represented here. I took a peek at the attendee list, and I've got a bunch of heroes present today. So thanks to each of you for all the incredible work that you do. You've informed and inspired my work here at the foundation, and we definitely stand on your shoulders. So thank you. So the Storer Foundation believes that children really thrive across developmental domains when they're deeply connected to their place. And we believe that we should start that connection as soon as possible, which is the early years, and then especially preschool. We also recognize that the health benefits of access to the outdoors, the experience of growing and eating fresh food, for example, and honestly, just like the wonder and joy of being connected to the natural world are not equally accessible across communities. So we've spent the last decade trying to address the systems and barriers that have created the situation. While we don't directly fund individual on-the-ground programs, just because we are like sort of a rounding error compared to the big guys funding this work, we do work on state licensure. We work on state licensure and regulatory language. We work on outdoor preschool policies like the one that we just saw passed in Washington State. We're investing in teacher professional development pipelines at colleges and universities spread out across the United States. plus funding some professional learning communities for current teachers who weren't able to experience those certificate or concentration programs, but are doing the work and practicing it in their own centers and schools. We're underwriting research, and we realized that we were missing one important part, which was developing effective communication and messaging guidelines for the field and the movement. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I do want to highlight that my favorite fact from the report is that funders are the least influential voices here, which I think is an important thing to highlight, because the most influential voices and the ones that most effectively communicate the urgency and the value of this work are the ones that know it best. And that's you guys, the educators and the teachers. So I'm especially grateful for you for being here today or watching the recording later. And I just hope that this event will help you better tell your stories to the funders in your communities, but also the legislators, your licensure agents, and the other decision makers that impact the work that you do. So again, thank you so much for everything you guys do. We'll keep fighting the good fight at the systems level. And as a mother of two toddlers, I understand and deeply appreciate the work that you guys do day to day. So back to you, Christy.
Thank you, Kathleen, and thank you so much to the Storer Foundation for all you've done to really help build the field sort of at that infrastructure level. It's been so powerful for the movement. So I mentioned at the start that this webinar is co-hosted with the National Wildlife Federation's ECHO program. So I'm going to turn it over now to Liz Houston. She's the Deputy Director of Partnerships and Development at ECHO, and a wonderful partner that we love to work with. So off to you, Liz.
Thank you, Christy. Hi, everyone. It's so great to see the participants from across the country here. Very excited that you're all joining us for this conversation. I'm going to talk a little bit about our program, how we support early outdoor learning. Then we'll jump into our collective work and how we all need to find those resources to support that work. We're going to spend some time reflecting on the input you provided when you registered, because it was invaluable. And then I'll turn things over to our featured speakers. So on the next slide, please. At the National Wildlife Federation, like many of you, one of our main priorities is connecting kids to nature. This focus is especially important because we know that children who have outdoor nature experiences grow into adults who care about wildlife and our environment. And this work has to start with our youngest children. We know we have the greatest impact when we engage with children early in life. So on the next slide, we created ECHO. Our vision is to connect every young child, including infants and toddlers, to nature every day. And on the next slide, you can see our vision. How we go about doing this is that we facilitate the co-creation of nature-based outdoor play settings through landscape design assistance and technical support. And we provide training and resources for parents, caregivers, and educators to activate these settings. We also advocate for state and federal policies, rules, and regulations to make high-quality outdoor play and learning more accessible to more children. Next slide, please. So switching gears, let's talk about our collective impact. Lots of folks in the room, and we know, all of us, that our work is critically important to both healthy child development and a healthy planet. But we need funding to support these efforts. And we're so grateful that you all, many of you, provided such rich answers to the questions that we asked when you registered. So we're going to reflect on those questions for a few minutes. On this next slide, I know I'm breaking every PowerPoint rule on the planet. There's too much on this slide, but you provided so much rich information. I kind of crammed it all in there. But one of the first questions we asked was, what barriers do you face to funding? And these are some of the common things. Some folks pointed out they are private organizations. They can't get funding because they're private. That next bullet, not enough, fill in the blank, right? Time, capacity, whatever it may be. Archaic concepts of childcare in our society. I think that links to the next one. Many organizations, corporations, individuals don't understand how this work impacts future workers. Constraints from systems like public schools. A lot of folks have trouble getting funding if the project is inaccessible to the public. Finding the right words to describe the value. Boy, that is spot on with what we're going to be talking about today. So thank you for that input. This next one resonates, I think, with a lot of us. This work does not fit into one category very neatly. It's cross-domain. Someone said our own organization puts up some barriers by not creating dedicated spaces. So some internal challenges. And this last one, I think we can all relate to. Access to nature is quietly regarded as a nice to have, not a need to have. On the next slide, we asked you another question. Which funders would you like to approach? And somebody said big funders, supporting systems change and networks. Absolutely. Could not agree more. Equity-centered organizations. The next couple of bullets is kind of a laundry list of various kinds of funders, corporations, land trusts, museums, land use planners. These are all great ideas and great context for our conversation today. Governments, departments of health, legislators who have skin in the game. It's a great answer. Those interested in social emotional development, teaching sustainability in early childhood. Equity comes up again, and access. Funders that support community-based research and long-term projects. So thank you again for all of that input. That was incredibly valuable to us. The next slide, I just wanted to put this up as a reminder of just some of the benefits to our collective work. However, on the next slide, we also know that there are just too many families and communities who do not have easy access to healthy, dynamic outdoor spaces. And for children who lack access to the developmental benefits of nearby nature in their home environments due to systemic racism and its impact on the built environment, bringing nature into their daily lives is one way to offset this disparity. So now we're going to get to the good stuff. I can't tell you how excited I am about the findings in this report we'll be diving into today. So let's get to it. As we move forward, again, please put your questions in the chat. We'll be sure to stop from time to time for Q&A, but I'm thrilled to introduce again our featured guests from 7 November. Susan Pearson Brown is founder and principal, and Kate Rose is a strategist and writer. Ladies, please take it away, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Liz. Appreciate that great framing. And thank you everyone for joining us today. We are really excited to be in community with all of you and sharing some of the research that we have put together. So my name is Susan Pearson Brown. I'm a strategic communications consultant. I am based on the ancestral and unceded lands of the Coast Salish peoples, today known as Seattle, Washington. But I work with a variety of social justice organizations all over the country, including those you see on the screen and those that you have already heard from today. And I'm joined by my colleague and collaborator, Kate Rose. Kate, give everyone a wave, there you are. And what Kate and I are going to do over the next maybe 15 minutes or so is walk you all through a study that we did, funded by the Pisces Foundation and the Steward Foundation, to really take a look at how we can approach messaging in a really comprehensive way that supports those of you that are doing the work to bring very young children into these meaningful experiences outdoors. How can we perhaps take that story and tell it in a really compelling way to the funders that you may not always be in community with? And we define that as being funders of early childhood education writ large. So not necessarily in the outdoor space, although some had some work in there, but just the overall field of early learning. How could we bring some of those folks into the conversation? So this is work we did just about a year ago. We had this in the field from July through October of 2021. It's a relatively small scale study as these things go, but it did unearth some very, very interesting information. So let's get to it. We always start any consulting engagement with What are the questions? What are we trying to understand for our clients? And in this case, we came up with 3. The first one is, how are we as a community of folks that are providing early learning outdoors? How are we talking about that today? And how's it landing? And then let's just take a little look over to the side. What are these early childhood education funders? Again, not necessarily in the outdoor space, but just generalized early childhood ed funders. What are their priorities? And what messaging are they open to hearing? And then finally, how do we bridge the gaps between our field and this new audience? How can we do that through strategic communications, hopefully bringing more partners into the work? Kate's going to talk to us a little bit about the methodology.
Hi, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm joining you from nice and land, otherwise referred to as Sacramento. And I'm seeing in the chat so much representation from the field. So I'm just so appreciative that you all are here. And Susan and I are really honored to be joining you. Last week, my niece she's 6, and she was telling me about an outdoor program that she had. She was telling me why lizards do push-ups. And we just got into this great conversation. It was just so rich. So I'm so appreciative of all the work that you do and such an opportunity to join you. So thought I would disclaimer that before we get into this. So in order to, Kathleen, I'll follow up with you later. Rachel will be happy to tell you about it. So in order to answer the big questions that Susan was talking about, we started with an audit and analysis of some of the existing messaging that we were seeing in the field. So on the left here, you'll see we began with the Story Foundation and grantees, others in the work, Natural Start Alliance joining us today. And where possible, we were able to speak with a representative, obviously for that core group. On the left, we spoke with everyone. And then on the right, we have funders and policy advocates that are in the early childhood education space, but may not have programming around nature-based or outdoor education. So in all cases, we looked at the publicly available materials, did sort of an audit and analysis of the existing messages, common vocabulary values, and then the interviews, just to explain the methodology a little bit, were one-on-one with, in this case, we had 4 partners who were advancing environmental education for young learners, and then 5 additional national early childhood education funders to really test those values, messages, vocabulary. And then the final component was an online survey that we will show you some of those results. That's when I start to nerd out about ranking of communication preferences. So whether people find messages compelling, credible, that type of thing. So that's how we approached it. And this is just a snapshot of what came out of those conversations, which are all available in the final report. It's not meant to be an eye test. You don't need to read through all of them, but they are available in the report. And what I want to highlight is that we started to see some themes emerge as you kind of take in some of these quotes. We saw there were a variety of perceptions around what early childhood education is. Some variance in how quality is measured or defined. And then some of the connotations around language in the field, we're seeing some differences in people describing it as outdoor learning versus nature-based versus outdoor play, for example, and a little bit more about how funders thought about investments in early childhood education. We won't get into this one too much, but in the top left, you can see this person's perception was that it's not a modest or low-cost investment. One must invest in outdoor spaces just as much as indoor. That was something that started Susan and I thinking, like, are the ease of implementation messages going to be as effective as we think, and maybe what data might be persuasive in that area? So I'll give you, you can see those in the final report. But and so, not to oversimplify, because of course there's a lot of nuances within this conversation, but primarily the funders and providers of early outdoor learning were focused mainly on environmental literacy messages, promoting the physical health benefits, equity and access for young children. And then the funders of early childhood education overall were more we're prioritizing educational achievement gaps. You can see equity here also, and then provider support, either through the forms of professional development and licensure. So what I wanted to call out here is that there's a possibility to lose the funder audience by focusing solely on that environmental literacy piece, but a bigger opportunity around this unifying message if you're able to speak to the systemic issues that contribute to poor quality early childhood education. So Susan's going to tell you more about where we went from there.
Yeah, thank you, Kate. And I realize I should have started out by saying that we're gonna walk through a lot of material really quickly, but we are saving some time at the end for questions. So as questions occur to you, please drop them in the chat if you haven't already, and then we'll try to get to as many of those as we can at the end. And as Kate said, this is a quick pass through a much, much larger report that is available for all of you up on the Natural Start Alliance site, and I hope you all dig deep into it later on. But let's get moving. So what did we learn after we did all of this study, right? Well, this won't be a shock to anyone on this webinar, but childcare is tough today, right? There's the workforce is challenged. Communities are pushing for more, better, at times universal access. Parents and lawmakers are saying it has to be quality. The workforce is undercompensated. There's high turnover. We could go on and on and on, but this is the world that we exist in today, right? Now we know there's some new federal dollars that are flowing to the sector, but there's a lot of competing priorities for those. And if we come forward and talk about outdoor learning as being something that should be one of these priorities, we have to be very careful how we talk about it, because if it is seen as additive or expensive, it becomes very easy for people to reject. So part of what we really want to be thinking about in our messaging is things that wrap outdoor learning into a child's everyday experience at a low cost. And we always want to be cognizant of the caregiver perspective in any messaging that we do. This was kind of an interesting thing I thought when we were in the early learning community and we were talking with folks. When we were talking to people who really genuinely understand how young children learn, they really do lean into outdoor learning, and they get that it's a component of a quality learning environment. If they know the importance of play-based learning between 0 to 5 and having sensory experiences and safe connections to caregivers and all those good things, they're like, yeah, outdoor learning, that makes sense. The trick is not everybody we're talking to is well-versed in child development, particularly policymakers. So in that case, we really have to wrap our language around how children learn. We have to kind of almost do a little educational piece about that so that they can get on board also. Because if they're not on board, then again, it's really easy for those folks to frame outdoor learning as ancillary, additive, and sounding expensive, which is not what we want. We found some pretty distinct geographic variances in the messages that we tested. And we'll get into the test in a moment, but the short of it is we put up messages and we asked people to tell us how compelling or how credible they find them. And we found some real differences in those rankings depending on where people live. There's different perceptions of early learning outdoors between urban and rural audiences, between folks who live in a colder or warmer climate, and certainly between red and blue states. Just one example, one of the funders we were talking to about this said that their particular state's licensing guidelines for childcare centers actually prohibit teachers from taking children outdoors when the heat index is above or the chill temperature is below a certain marker. So in that state, with those people, if we go in saying outdoor education must be part of every young child's day, they're going to reject it, right? Because they technically can't sign up for that. So this is why we really tease out these different aspects of the messaging. As Kate mentioned a little bit earlier, we found equity to be the great equalizer across what our field is saying today and across what the early childhood funders are saying. Those messages tested very, very high on both credible and compelling scales. Particularly if we can frame outdoor learning for very young learners as a means of bridging opportunity gaps, which we used to call achievement gaps in education, but we want to asset frame that as more of an opportunity gap. If we can show outdoor learning as part of a solution for bridging those gaps, we get a lot of attention. It's very, very meaningful for people. There's a lot of quotes in the report. I just threw a few in here for us, but as you can see, that the messages that are the most resonant for folks are when we can talk about this as a medium for addressing inequity. Okay, what else? We talk a lot about quality in early childhood education. The challenge we found here is that there isn't yet a really universal understanding of how to define high quality early learning. And when we have a squishy definition, it's tricky to message around that because some people might define it the way we do and other people may not define it the way that we do. And so we kind of need to know what we're walking into when we talk about crafting our work as part of quality early childhood education. And again, we want to make sure that anything we're bringing forward is not necessarily seen as additive. We're not saying we need to add this into early learning to make it be quality. That gets people down the road of it's extra, it's expensive, all those things. So quality is something to be cautious about. We did test a number of return on investment messages. We heard from folks in the community that outdoor learning for early learners can be done, in a fairly affordable manner. There's fairly good return on investment. This certainly seemed appealing. Low cost, high value, usually a really good message. We tested that and we did get very high compelling ratings on that message. So people found that to be really evocative. But the challenge is they rated it fairly low on the credibility. So that means they like it, but they're not sure they believe it. This means if we're going to talk about return on investment messages, we have to back it up. We have to be able to show some proof of this. We also learned that when we open a conversation by talking about financial returns, pretty quickly people go to assumptions that the money is going to be used to create physical spaces or create infrastructure. And maybe it is in some cases, but probably not always. And this can be problematic because not all funders will say that they fund infrastructure. They don't all believe it's their thing to fund. Some think that should be the government, for example. So we want to be cautious how we talk about return on investment. We also tested a number of messages where we talk about outdoor learning and we used words like only or it must be part of the day. We used some absolute language just to kind of feel folks out and see if they were in agreement with us about the importance of this. And there was some concern with these messages that communicate outdoor learning as being a mandatory part of the quality. That we heard about there's different pedagogical approaches and there's multiple ways to define learning and there's multiple ways for students to learn and what works for one school won't work for another. And I know we all understand that. So when you see our final messaging, you'll see what we're going to do is try to soften that language a little bit to frame outdoor learning as one really good approach, but not the only approach that will lead to some connection and engagement. When we were talking about outdoor learning for the very young, we found that it's much more impactful when we can show people what we are talking about, because when we just use our words, if we don't use descriptive language or visuals or pictures, they often would get a different picture in their head. And again, they'd go to that infrastructure thing, right? Oh, you're going to build, a big play structure and we need to pour concrete. We need to do these things. And that's not really what we're talking about. But as soon as we said things like mud kitchens and tree trunks that kids could climb over, and we're doing this in a stream. And even though if we didn't do it with pictures, if we could just do it with our words, people really grasped it a lot better. So an important takeaway there to think about how you're presenting the information. And again, we talked about different ways of bringing folks in, and probably not a surprise to folks here, but we definitely heard a lot more heart for things when we talk about learning and growth. And, it's a little harder to warm up to things like facilities and infrastructure, even though it's important. So just want to be framing our messages around less about the structures and things where that stuff might happen and more about what actually happens outside. So when we go out and test messaging, the first thing that we do is actually not go in and say, hey, do you like this message? What we want to do is make sure that we're connecting with our new target audience at a values level. Values are the shortest bridge between two distinct audiences. So we know what we as an early learning community valued, and we have our list here. This was pretty quick and easy to come up with. But then we wanted to go out to our new audience, our generalized early childhood education funders. And we wanted to see what their organizations valued most prominently, so we could line our messaging up from that. So these were the messages that we tested. We asked folks to rate them on a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of how important this was to their organization, not their person, their organization, 10 being the highest possible score. And you can see, look what got a perfect 10, narrowing gaps and addressing disparities in education. Okay, that's our opportunity gap type message, 10 out of 10, perfect. The next couple ranked very, very highly. Physical health outcomes, mental health, educational outcomes, our diversity message, our family. Really, they all tested pretty well, except look what's on the bottom of my list there. Big drop off about environmental literacy. Now, probably not a huge surprise because we weren't talking to environmental funders, right? We were talking to education funders. But this is really telling because a lot of that message that Kate and I found in our audit, a lot of folks in the field are talking about environmental literacy. So just know if you're doing that, it's not going to be as resonant with the new audience as if you can tie into these top ranking values. So from there, we design messaging based on the values. As we went through, we learned quite a bit about the vocabulary that folks were using though, and I'm going to let Kate touch on these briefly.
Thanks, Susan. And I think Liz had mentioned one of the registrant comments that had come up. We'd like to know what are the right words to use with funders. So we looked at the most common vocabulary that was shared by partners about investing in outdoor experiences for young children. And we tested some of those things. So on this slide, you'll see some of those phrases and the connotations that we were learning about them. And we only share this, there's no sort of right or wrong phrases. It kind of goes back to what Susan was saying is tying back our language to the values of each audience. So it's not as though there's not do or don't words here, but it's just kind of understanding the associations that people have with some of these phrases. So for instance, one of the things that kind of stood out to me is nature-based preschool was a phrase that in some cases raised some questions of access and could be perceived as more elite. And then outdoor classrooms in particular, I think we began to see that they were seen more as using that phrasing, people pictured outside of formal learning settings, excuse me. And so more structured than just purely informal learning, but we raise this in terms of when you're using these phrases, maybe becoming familiar with the connotations that folks have and just kind of appreciating some of those nuances.
Thanks, Kate. So again, not intended to be an eye chart. I know there's a lot of words on here. You don't need to read every last one, but I did want to show you how we tested each message and what the results were. And so what we did, after we had our tested values, we had the language from the field, and Kate and I had a little bit of an advantage too, because I was the lead consultant on the Rethink Outside shared narrative development, and I already kind of knew some of the values and messaging that tested well there. We had done some similar projects for NAAE. So we had some stuff that we thought probably will work, and we started with that. And we put together, I think it's 10 messages you see here on the left, that just talked about all these things in different ways. And the way that we do it is it's an online environment. The person that we're talking with sees one statement at a time in a randomized order. So we solve for that. And in each case, we say, please tell us how compelling this message is and also how credible. So compelling is it evocative, interesting, credible, believable, true. They could give them the same score, different scores, didn't matter. And then I'm a hard grader too. So I like to have a second data point, which is how many people rated this particular message a 9 or a 10 on each scale. And that just gives me a little bit more information to go on. So what you can see here, and this is roughly how they shook out, is, these are pretty good. Our top one got a 9.2 on compelling. This is all about expanding access. The second one is also an equity message. We talk about physical and mental health in the third one. So these are all pretty good. But what's very interesting in this study, and I'm going to show you two in particular here, is we actually saw a pretty interesting gap between the compelling rating and the credible rating. So the first one got a 9.2 on compelling, but only 7.4, almost a 2-point drop on credible. Same one for the second one that I highlighted, almost a 2-point drop in between them. To me, that says they liked these messages, they found them compelling, but they didn't quite believe them. So that means we're on the right path. It's always harder to make them compelling, trust me. So we're going down the right road, but we have to be able to back it up to get our credibility numbers up. The other thing you might notice about these two messages that I've circled is they both use the word must. Early childhood education must include blah, blah, blah. For it to be high quality, it must have these other things. And in our interviews, when we were teasing some of this out, it was words like must or only, or sort of the only way to do things that people bristled with a little bit, didn't necessarily believe that's true. So I do think, and you'll see in the final messaging, we took some of those absolutes out. I think doing that will increase the credibility of it. So again, all this is in the final report. You can dive through all the messages. Kate, you want to talk about messengers?
Definitely. And I just wanted to kind of qualify messengers, communication speak for who are you hearing from when you're thinking about early childhood education, or who the funder is hearing from. So we asked them to give us a ranking of who might be most influential. And as Kathleen mentioned at the top of the webinar, providers and teachers were at the top of that list pretty strongly, 7.6, followed pretty closely by parents or guardians of young children who are experiencing outdoor learning. So that gets me excited because there are so many incredible stories to be told from those individuals, and sort of kind of a little bit more middle ground with the academics studying the effects of outdoor learning. Executive directors of nonprofits are still in that middle tier, and sorry to our funder philanthropist friends, less persuasive to these audiences, along with policymakers. So I just find that this is it's permission, and I hope that the folks on this call are understanding that your voices are so needed in this conversation, and that they are valued by the funders that we're trying to reach. So message supports another comm speak. It's just like how do we back up what we're saying? And so stories from childcare providers themselves ranked really highly. And then this one was interesting to me because shortly after that, academic and scientific data about the long-term benefits of time learning outdoors was rated pretty highly. You'll see economic data is kind of closely following that. And so the way that I would think about this, even if outside of communications, in terms of, as you're thinking about who you might be trying to reach, just prioritizing those stories from childcare providers, teachers, and making sure that that's being shared from their perspective. I think all types of supporting information tested pretty well, but there was that preference for stories from teachers. So Susan's gonna walk us through the next.
Thanks, Kate. And I would just add too, where you see the high ranking about the academic information, the economic data that coming in 8, almost 9 there. Again, that's just another point that shows us that we need to back up what we're talking about. So, nobody on the earlier messenger side said, I want to hear from an economist. An economist is my most influential storyteller, but they want to see the data. So that's where, if you can have a story from a provider or family, and you can drop in the data or the academic research, you're going to have like a 1-2 punch. That's going to be very, very powerful. Okay, so we always like to come in with recommendations, not just dump a bunch of information on you. So I walk through these pretty quickly, but as you go forward and start to use the messaging, here's a couple of things to think about. We found that it's going to be most impactful if you can frame your messaging around the top values that are shared with this new audience, right? So that's minimizing education gaps. We want to talk about equity, and we want to talk about health benefits. So think about in your conversations leaning into education and health, and maybe we lean a little bit away from environmental literacy and conservation. We have to be descriptive, paint vivid pictures with your words, or better yet, with an actual picture of what early outdoor learning can look like. We want to stay away from language that communicates I'm building something in big and new and expensive facility. Stay away from language that says I'm taking children away from these centers and schools and into a journey into nature. These are very little children, and people were very much bristling about the idea of taking them across busy streets and on buses and things like that. So be careful. Use evocative language, water play, gathering leaves, balancing on tree trunks. These really, really got people excited. As we talked about earlier, you have to bolster those messages. So it's not just enough to say them, we got to back it up, okay? So we need to talk about cost benefits with data and examples. We need to find research that quantifies the benefits of outdoor learning at very, very young ages. this will probably make you laugh since you saw my very dense messaging slide a minute ago, but really, as much as we can keep these messages succinct, jargon-free, and non-hyperbolic as possible, they will always land better. And we talked earlier about some of the really specific language that we teased out with folks. And I always like to offer this up to people. And I just say, these are words to watch, words to be aware of. We're not saying absolutely never say this or only say that. I just want you guys to know how this resonates with the audiences that you're trying to talk about. And so this might be just kind of a little cheat sheet to use when you go forth. So nature-based preschool, you know, here in Washington State, we love our nature-based preschool. Totally fine to use it in these blue states. Use it with audiences that are familiar with, have affection for the work, all good. Outdoor-centric learning is something that we were talking about and playing with a little bit, where we might talk about a program where the outdoors is fully integrated into the school day. It's very active. And then outdoor learning experiences seem to be more evocative for these informal learning experiences, or perhaps where outdoor learning is just part of the curriculum. It's not the entire school day. So hopefully that's helpful with future messaging. So some narrative ideas for folks. We want to elevate our teachers as our storytellers, as our messengers. I would love if somebody wanted to create a master educator program and really move this forward. I know that's a big lift, but you get the idea, really to have a chorus of voices of educators as opposed to a couple of soloists here and there would be really, really powerful. And I also think there's a real opportunity to look for these national conversations around what quality childcare looks like today. Not necessarily outdoor childcare, but just what is quality childcare? You don't have to look far in the education media or in some of the mainstream media to see that happening. Is there ways that we can insert ourselves in there and talk about outdoor learning as part of the solution? Could be really interesting. Think about ways that you might partner with maybe some different audiences. Again, we saw there's a real appetite for an economic story. Well, the business press covers economics. Is there a way to pitch stories there to talk about this as a solution for long-term savings in education? Could be really interesting. If you're a great writer or speaker, you know, think about publishing some of these thought pieces on the whole picture of childcare today, with outdoor learning as a tool for addressing systemic barriers. So again, we get to talk about those opportunity gaps, and we get to talk about equity, all those things that we know resonate really well. So I took our 10 initially tested messages, I boiled it down to 6 that tested the most positively. We made tweaks based on what we heard. So we removed some of the absolute language and things like that. And these are the 6 that we recommend use going forward. But again, it's not absolute. If there was others on the list, they all did test pretty well. So you should feel free to help yourself there. And that's it. Those are my final slides. I'm going to stop sharing because I think you've heard enough from me. And I'll just pass it over to see if there was any questions.
Yeah, I was just, oh, sorry, Emily, not to cut you off. I was just making sure we got the ones in the chat. There was a question from Kelly Morrill about, I'm curious what you heard from folks about outdoor environment versus recess. I wondered if the messaging about how high quality learning must include outdoor access was misinterpreted as a good preschool schedule should include recess daily, or some equivalent message about daily movement, not necessarily an outdoor learning environment. I was just in the middle of responding to that and figured we would just take that one live. The things that come up for me is that recess didn't really emerge in our communications audit or from the interviews with external stakeholders. So we didn't end up testing that, but there was a value in access to outdoor spaces, like kind of separate from kind of more formal learning there. But I don't know if you wanted to add to that, Susan. Not sure we didn't test recess.
I could go, bear with me because it was a year ago that we did the test. But I don't recall, we certainly didn't intentionally test recess related language. And I don't recall it coming up in a meaningful way, but I would be happy to go back and check on that. Thank you for raising that. I'll turn it over to Christina because I know she's been monitoring the chat and was going to prioritize some for us.
Yeah, and thank you, Kate. You especially, I noticed, were in there real active trying to get to some of those questions. And there were a lot of questions. So maybe you can keep looking at those, Kate, and we won't be able to get to them all. So as you have a little bit of time during the rest of our time, maybe you could take a look at those too. But it definitely seemed like there were a number of questions about kind of the specific language, different questions about different words that people were wondering about. And I wonder if it's possible to just sort of lump those together, and just any guidance for folks who are thinking about specific phrases or words that you haven't addressed here, how they might be able to think about the funder that they're talking to, the audience that they're talking to, and get a sense for the kinds of language that might resonate most with them. Does that make sense?
Yes, I can tell you that the 6 messages on that final slide I show are very well vetted, very well tested. Every word has been scrubbed. I'm very confident those will work. That's why we're giving them to you today. So please use those. For words that aren't there, or maybe we didn't test, maybe we didn't think of them, or I don't know, but it's hard for me to say kind of just overall what's going to work and what's not going to work. That's why we do these tests to find out. So I would stick with the tested messaging. If you're not seeing anything in there that is specific to you or warms your heart, I would go back to the values that we tested, and you can see where those shook out in terms of our top connection point with the funders. Take a value or 2 off the top and say, how would I talk about this in my work? And then that should give you a good head start.
Great, thank you. I think we should go on. We have, as I said, more questions in the chat. Kate, maybe you can work on some of those as we go, but we wanted to share a couple of examples of how some of these messages can look in practice, and not new examples, but things that are happening already in the field. So Liz and I just kind of looked through our networks and kind of within our sphere to identify a couple of examples. And I wanted to share the first one, which is from a program called Slide into Success. It is a partnership between the Smith Memorial Playground and the Parent Infant Center in Philadelphia. They are both amazing programs. They're part of the Natural Start Alliance. And this program is funded by an early childhood funder, Vanguard Strong Start for Kids. And I pulled it because I thought it was a really great example of some of the themes that are part of the report, especially using teachers as the messenger. I think they did a really nice job of, and they really centered equity in their message. This is just a clip. We'll share the link to the full video, but I just wanted to give you a sense for it.
I feel like your zip code shouldn't dictate the start that you get in life. We were strategically and purposefully placed in this location because I wanted to be in an area that did not have a lot of high quality early learning programs. Early childhood education is the foundation. It's the beginning of everything. And in order to lift children out of poverty or different situations, we have to give them a strong start.
Early child care is very beneficial, it's rewarding. It draws a bond between you, the child that you're caring for, their parents, because we are the stepping stone for these kids. We kind of mold them for their outcome.
This is the first program like this, where we're being offered training, opportunity for our children to come out and play at Smith Playground. Buses are provided for us to get to Smith Playground and back. I mean, that's huge. Usually we can't go anywhere without a bunch of parents volunteering to drive.
I love Smith, just the openness, the safeness of it. And my kids love the openness. You know, I can sit in one spot and be like, I'm here, so you come back to me, and I'm safe. And I feel okay about that.
We've had a chance to go to the Parent Infant Center. We've observed their classrooms, which are utterly amazing. The training that we've gotten for our teachers and for myself, I don't even know how to put a price on that. It's priceless.
Going to PIC it's like a brand new world to me, because it's opened my eyes up that there's other stuff out there for me to grow, for me to get involved with, to learn, that I can bring back and share with my staff and the children.
It cost a whole lot of money and student loans and everything to go back to school. And wow, this is being funded and provided for us.
Anyway, I love that video. It makes me feel so happy about the work that we all do. So I'm going to turn it over to Liz for some more.
Thanks, Christy. I think we've got some slides to pull up for an example that I would like to share. There we go. Thank you. So I'm going to just talk briefly about a project we've been working on. We've got a family foundation that's funding our work in Texas to complement a lot of work that's already been happening on the ground by a lot of partners, including our partner at the Natural Learning Initiative, to bring better learning to more children through nature, play, and exploration, specifically at family childcare homes, like the one you see here. Here is an image of a family childcare space that we worked with and collaborated with in Colorado. They incorporated natural elements, and this was the result of training and resources and some very limited design assistance from ECHO. So of course, the photo on the left is what the site looked like before. And the photo on the right shows how this childcare provider made her vision for the space come to life. And we just really helped her organize her ideas here. So notably, with respect to the messaging that we just heard about, this program and others that I'll show in just a minute made these renovations with mini grants ranging from just $100 to $500, a very small investment. And this really further underscores that this effort is very different than traditional capital or quality improvement initiatives. Can we go to the next slide? Again, you can see that these changes are much more than just building playgrounds, right? You can see the proliferation of gardens and mud kitchens and sound gardens. On the next slide, you can see additional simple activities. And the providers at these spaces were coached to seek out community resources and support, but they did so and they implemented affordable, engaging play settings that cost much less than traditional play equipment, but that offer expanded play value and are much more dynamic in nature. And so just to round out our discussion on the next slide, again, so many of these messages resonate with ECHO and our particular work, but some of these that I think come through in the images you just saw, that capital facility investments are just not always necessary. And as Susan said, connecting outdoor learning with everyday experiences at low cost is really key to all of our work, I think. And stressing that outdoor learning is one way to address opportunity gaps and inequities. And then again, telling, showing, sharing evocative stories that precisely, in a really compelling way, colorful ways, describe what we mean. So with that, we're going to switch to Q&A. We've got about 6 minutes left. I don't think we're going to be able to answer all of the questions, but let's just get going here. From Andrew, interested in the centrality of learning in so many of the statements, by comparison with a possibly broader take on early childhood success to include the full range of early childhood development factors. Does someone want to take that on?
Yeah, Liz, chat's blowing up. Good to see the engagement here. So I think my response to Andrew kind of got lost. But for this study, we look specifically at learning environments because that was sort of the charter of the Storer Foundation to us, because they're focused on expanding outdoor early childhood ed. But there's definitely an opportunity for the broader early childhood development space. I think we were just kind of focused on learning environments because that was the kind of the specifics of the study. I don't know if you would add anything there, Susan.
No, although I think that that would be a really interesting area to test a little bit further.
If anything, so many intersections to the work, and just making the case for early childhood development in so many contexts, I think, is what emerged. But thanks, Liz.
Yes, thank you. And thanks for diving a little bit deeper on that one. Like you said, we're getting tons of questions here. Kathleen, here's one that maybe you could answer. Are you seeing any trends in funding outdoor learning within the funding community?
Yeah, that's a great question. So due to a lot of different factors, especially the pandemic, I think people are recognizing that that there's you don't catch a cold from being cold, you catch a cold from being indoors. And that certainly resonated for children who were still waiting to have our kids vaccinated and feel a little safer against COVID. But I'm seeing so many funders become interested in this space, but in different ways. And I think the best candidates, especially for individual preschools, is to look at funders that are focused on their community specifically. So place-based funders, donor advised funds at community foundations, community foundation mini grants. I'd also say that I've been seeing success from networks of educators working together to create a cohort and get a bigger grant that way. So for example, like a cohort of preschool leaders that identify as Black, Indigenous, or people of color who are coming together. It's easier for a funder to fund work that's a collaboration among like 3 or 4 or 5 preschools than just individual grants. It feels like a higher pivot or higher leverage point. And then like partnerships between Head Starts and private preschools. I am seeing funders recognize that there's been a dearth of funding at the intersection between climate and childhood, which Christine brought up. And there's something called the Childhood Climate Initiative out of Capita Social that's really like ramping up the issue, working on a communications structure. And the way that it would impact this group of folks is thinking about how childcare centers need shade equity and they need stormwater management. So like dry creeks that run through the outdoor learning environment and other drought resistant vegetation and habitat for pollinators. And that's a place where I'm hoping that we can change some systems and the way that public funds are available to the built environment for kids, just to make it easier to transform those things. But I'm seeing a ton of interest from other funders emailing me to talk to me about what we're doing. And I'm really hoping that between the interest and having a effective narrative, we can make sure that money flows to our earliest learners.
Excellent. Thanks, Kathleen. How about just one more? Oh, maybe not. I think we're gonna close out the conversation, but these are great questions. I think we're going to provide some follow-up, Christy, is that correct? And maybe be able to answer some of these questions in a follow-up email.
Yes, we will follow up with everyone who registered for the webinar with all of this information, links, and all the rest. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of quick links really quickly before we go. The report is available again at naturalstarts.org. It was shared here. We'll share it on the site. I wanted to also point out Rethink Outside. It came up just really briefly, but it also has some really wonderful communications guidance for the field. And I think it's worth taking a look at if you're not familiar with it already. And I also wanted to point out that we have the Natural Start conference coming up next month, and it's a really great place to connect with everyone, learn more about all of the work that's going on across the field. And that conference is available both in person and online this year. So whichever way suits you best, we have options for you. You could go ahead, Emily. 2 more. And that's it, folks. Thank you very much for your time today. We so appreciate it. Thank you to Susan and Kate for the incredible work you did. Thank you for taking the time to go over everything today. To Kathleen for being here. Liz for providing this really great perspective. And it's been a wonderful partnership to work with you. So thanks, everyone. Have a great day.